Welcome to No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. If you have been checking in on Twitterland over the last couple of weeks, you will see a huge debate about free speech prompted by a piece of government legislation. When a government says it wants the right to censor speech that is critical of that government, I get nervous. It is my most serious concern of many troubling aspects of Bill C-10. Yes, we do need to update the Broadcasting Act. And yes, big tech needs to be more transparent and probably pay a little more. This bill has now been sent off to committee in the fall. If there's an election, it will die. And what I'm most grateful for is there will be a time, we hope, to rewrite and rethink this bill. Dr. Michael Geist is the law professor at the University of Ottawa, where he holds the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law and is a member of the Centre for Law, Technology and Society. And I've got to say, he has been a dogged observer of the government's attempts to deal with this legislation and changing the rules of the road for both Internet and legacy media. He's been following every committee hearing and following the Senate. So thank you very much, Michael, for doing this and being with us today. So there will be, any way we cut it, really time to rethink this particular piece of legislation and Bill 36, which is a companion piece. As you look back over it now, what's your biggest concern about this bill?
Well, I think it's hard to pick just one in some ways. I mean, I think certainly the issue that sparked a lot of attention, of course, is and remains a significant concern. The attempt to expand the scope of the legislation to include user-generated content, and in doing so, create a framework where it would be treated as a program under the law by the CRTC and subject to potential CRTC regulations. And certainly, as I referenced on many occasions, we would quite literally be the only country in the world that would seek to do this. I think countries have recognized that there may be some value in moving towards obviously updating broadcast regulation, even addressing some of the kinds of issues that are in C-10, but user-generated content is invariably excluded except here, and I think that was a big mistake. I just
remind people what there was a section in the original Bill 4.1 that says user-generated content like my posts or tweets or posts Facebook or YouTube, they would be exempt. They would not be touched by whatever regulatory scheme came into place. But then the government took that out and would not put it back in. So that's what created all the concern, because if you're not excluded, you're included.
Yeah, that's right. The default was that all audio visual content, wherever located, wherever the service happened to be, or if it's just an individual, was all captured potentially by the act, so long as there was some Canadian connection. And then it would fall to the CRTC to begin to make choices about what the thresholds might be and whether or not they would exclude some. Now, initially, they said that they would exclude both users and user-generated and the content they create from the scope of the law. But in backtracking, they effectively maintained the exclusion for users in the sense that they wouldn't be treated like a broadcaster, so they wouldn't have to show up for a hearing at the CRTC, right. But they ensured that their content was still subject to the legislation. And as Senator Husakis mentioned during the debate, I mean, the effect of that, you don't really have full expression if ultimately the CRTC begins to have the power to begin to influence some of these algorithms and make choices about prioritizing or deprioritizing certain content.
And that's the issue with the algorithms, the big tech algorithms, which we already have. I mean, we get content pushed at us that they want us to see because they own the company or they own the product. So that pushes stuff up and closer into our face. But the result of that, obviously, is that comes up means that there's something else that's going down. And that's kind of another level of an attack on free expression or free speech, however you want to call it.
Yeah, I think that's true. Now, it is also, of course, true that these companies employ algorithms and are making these choices. I think that there are at least a couple of responses to that. One is that I think there is a need for greater algorithmic transparency. We should know more about the kinds of choices these companies are making, why it is that we see what we see. And so that this is not to say there isn't a role for regulation, and it's not to say there isn't even a role for regulation with respect to algorithms to ensure that we have that kind of transparency. But substituting the choices of these private companies for the CRTC choices, I don't think is the right way to go. And I think, especially in the case of some of these services, the critics of these companies invariably, recognize that the algorithms' primary goal is to keep people on the platforms and keep people engaged, right? So it is in the incentives for these companies line up to try to ensure that people see stuff that they believe they want to see. Why? Because their goal is to keep you on the platform for as long as possible, or in the case of Netflix, to keep you subscribing. So they have no interest whatsoever in trying to hide content that you would otherwise want to see. So if, for example, for those that are big supporters of Canadian content and want to see Canadian content, so long as it's quite clear that that's the kind of content that you're watching, it is certainly the incentives are all there for the platforms or for services like Netflix to provide or to show you potential other Canadian content, recognizing that that's the stuff you like. That's quite different.
That's what happens. It pushes it toward me.
Exactly. And of course, that's quite different from a conventional broadcaster who, to the extent to which they show certain kinds of content, it's a regulatory obligation, not a matter of trying to meet the customer's needs, right? So if they put a Canadian program that they don't think will be particularly popular at a time that isn't very popular during the week, let's say Friday evening, when they just they've got to meet the regulatory requirements. So that's when it's there. That's the bygone era where there's a concern of how is this program going to get discovered? That's a very different model from a model that you would find on a Netflix, where if what you're looking for is Juste Déclin, the Netflix-backed French language film filmed in Quebec, they're going to try to make sure that you see it. And in fact, Netflix has noted that it's been viewed more than 20 million times, 95% of which comes from people from around the world. It's in their interests to ensure that people see stuff they want to see, so they keep subscribing.
So that's the issue, because in the old days and in the legacy media, that was the problem. Canadian content had to be mandated, because how are we going to keep actors and singers and musicians and even journalists alive if it wasn't mandated watching? But actually the internet, in a way, solves a lot of that problem, because it does push that content that you watch. They give you similar content to watch. If you like Canadian content, if you want French language movies, if you want East Indian movies, whatever it is, that's what they'll give you.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And that's even in the curated context. The idea that we would even try to take those kinds of rules and apply them in a user-generated content world where we haven't even defined typically the content for these sorts of buckets. Say, what's Canadian, what isn't? Is a Canadian now living in the United States who has a popular YouTube show or TikTok channel, and there are many of those. Is that Canadian content? So does it remain Canadian if the person is Canadian? If it's somebody who comes into Canada but they're not Canadian, is that Canadian content? If it is a joint series where someone's Canadian, someone isn't, is that Canadian? I mean, we just don't have any rules for this. We saw a number of, at least members of Parliament, argue, well, we can just adapt the long-standing rules for large films into a user-generated content world. But I think that fundamentally misunderstands the medium and how it is that so much of this content gets created.
Well, even on the question of Canadian content itself, certainly I argue, and I know others have, is that in a way we should be past that. We should be out there on the merits of the quality of the product we produce, whether it's a news program, a podcast, a movie, it doesn't matter. You can't force people to watch stuff that isn't good. So let's just make it good. And if Canadians are doing it, that's a bonus.
Yeah, I think that's true for the most part. And we had Senator Richards speak today. What I thought was a truly incredibly powerful, compelling speech. I mean, here's a Canadian author appointed by Justin Trudeau to the Senate, and the focus will invariably be, I think, quite rightly, his closing, where he says Bill C-10 doesn't need amendments; it needs a stake through the heart. But to your point, one of the other things that he said very early on is that it's only the work that matters. That, he's deeply suspicious of these efforts, whether by government or even other associations, to begin to cast kind of their views, their perspectives on the quality of that work, and then in a sense influence what other people get to see. And so, he stands steadfast against censorship and ultimately believes the quality of the work is really all that matters. And I think that's exactly what you're saying here, in terms of, so much really great work that's out there. And, we've got some really, ingenious entrepreneurial Canadians who are finding success on these different platforms. Nobody spoke to them as part of these hearings. And in fact, once these issues started coming up, you started to hear from different, especially members of parliament, who were quite dismissive in many instances of those kinds of creators, because it doesn't fit that kind of more traditional view of who counts. And, I thought what Senator Richards was trying to say is that everybody counts. What counts is the quality of their work. And one of the concerns with this legislation is that it tries to take us back to a time where you had to tick the right boxes in order for your work to count.
Well, and this is the problem. I mean, a lot of art and culture and creative material and animation and movies and books contains something that will be offensive to somebody somewhere along the line. If we start to say, if you offend anybody anywhere, then there's going to be a lot of blank screens.
No, I think so. Listen, of course, if we were to get into that level of oversight or potentially even censorship, then you're right. I mean, I think there's always going to be someone that's going to step forward and say that they're unhappy with this or with that. Now, I think the response would be that's not what the government intends with this bill. They intend instead to promote certain kinds of content. But as you and many others have, I think, repeatedly raised, the reality is that when you start making these kinds of choices, you both prioritize, but at the same time, it's just a natural. You also deprioritize other kinds of content. And, I think the fear for some, especially a fear for many of the digital first creators, is that they're going to be deprioritized. It's not that someone's going to say, we don't want you to see their stuff. It's just that they're going to say your stuff isn't really the stuff that we're actively trying to promote here. And so the effect of that will be to deprioritize their work.
That's the thing about, I understand the government's intent. They wanted, for their own reasons and probably some electoral purposes as well, to say to MPs and senators from Quebec, yes, we will start to try and make Netflix and YouTube have more French language speaking content on it. I'm again, that's not the way I see the world. I don't know if you can even do that. And it seems to me that, as to our earlier point, if I am sitting in front of my computer and I'm constantly looking for French language content, that will be found and put in front of me.
Yeah, no, I think that's I think that if the services aren't doing that, then you won't be a subscriber to the service for very long, because they're not providing you or showing you the kind of content that you want. And so there's little reason to subscribe to it. I mean, that highlights for me, again, one of the issues and frustrations I've had with this debate is these longstanding claims that somehow this is all about leveling the playing field. And, I've made the argument that broadcasters have certain advantages in this regulatory system. That's one reason that they pay. It's effectively a quid pro quo. And some of the advantages include must carry rules, where certain of these channels are required to be part of the various packages. And so the effect is that there's a guaranteed revenue stream. In those instances, you're getting the money so long as people remain as part of the system. In the streaming world, there are no guarantees. Anybody can walk away anytime. Nobody is required to be a Netflix subscriber, a Disney subscriber, or any of these other services. And you can walk away anytime you like. And so when you have to compete in that way, you have all the incentives you need to ensure that people feel that they're getting value for money and that they're being entertained, that there's something there worth paying for. And that one of the ways they try to do that, of course, is by using those algorithms to try to ensure that you're going to see stuff that interests you.
this discoverability issue, this word that is so loaded. You you want to be able to discover what's out there, but for what purpose and to what end.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So when we talk about money, I mean, certainly the minister and others have said, broadcasters are required to contribute to production funds, and so that domestic producers in whatever language are subsidized and can make it in a competitive world. Government is already doing that. They're sending money to news organizations. They're funding all sorts of operations under the guise of infrastructure. But if they want more money, can't they simply tax the big tech guys, the streaming services, and say, look, you're in competition with the domestic broadcasters and you've got to pay up?
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. Listen, the issue or the debate around, are these companies providing or contributing fairly within the jurisdiction? In most sectors, what that means is that you abide by the law and you pay your taxes, right? And so,
Yeah.
And it's not that these companies don't pay what's required. They do. The problem has been governments have really been slow to keep pace with the emergence of this kind of entity. Many of these large digital-based companies that, because of the way the services are structured, but because of the way they are able to structure themselves, can engage in very effective tax minimization strategies. And this isn't a Canadian-only issue. We see countries around the world that are grappling with this same question. So, if we want to ensure that there is what's viewed as fair compensation, or at least fair contribution into the country, well, then we need to ensure that these companies pay their fair share of tax. And for example, digital sales taxes will start on a national basis starting on July the 1st. So there is clearly that move to try to ensure that takes place. This idea, though, that they must also contribute into the system, which really lies at the heart of the Yale report, and then by extension, this legislation, I think falls apart once you recognize that the internet is not part of the system in the same way that the broadcasters and the radio stations are. That's not to say that there can't or shouldn't be rules for these companies, or even that we shouldn't be thinking specifically around some rules with respect to internet streaming services, but they should not be the same rules as television broadcasters or radio stations. If the whole if your premise is, well, these companies are the same, it's just all part of one big system. No, it's not. It's not part of the same system. And trying to adopt the same rules for those services quickly falls apart, as we saw, frankly, with this legislation. We saw it with its inclusion of certain changes to the Broadcasting Act that even the supporters of the bill were uncomfortable with, things like the ownership requirements and performers requirements that they be Canadian, intellectual property rules. Many of the policy objectives you have in a Canadian system fall apart once you say that the system is everyone. I mean, if the system is everyone, there is no Canadian system. You're simply saying that all audiovisual content everywhere is subject to Canadian rules.
And ask any 12-year-old if the internet is the same as their TV. And they may ask you what a TV is, because that's not how they deal with the world. And therefore, you can't just, include it and impose the same rules. It won't work.
Yeah, I think that's right. Obviously proponents of this say, listen, the content is in many instances the same. You can watch a streamed version of a show, or you can watch through the internet. You can watch it through a cable package or a satellite package. But the fact that the content is similar or the same isn't what we usually focus on from a broadcasting regulation perspective. I mean, delivery channels matter, and claims that this is regulating the same Canadian system when they aren't using the same spectrum, when they aren't engaged in some of the same kinds of practices, when they don't have the advantages that broadcasters have around must carry and some of the copyright rules and simultaneous substitution. This idea of it's all just a level playing field, I think quickly falls apart.
Well, that's the thing. The spectrum for television and radio, that's a limited domestic resource. The internet is a global operation. You just how is the rest of the world going to respond when the government of Canada says, we want to regulate the internet, make sure there's more Canadian content there, that a lot of different groups, linguistic and gender based, and the list is long, are discovered more easily, et cetera, et cetera. Is the rest of the world going to look at us and go, "What are you thinking?"
No, I think what the rest of the world, or at least many of the services that would be subject to that kind of regulation, will, well, they may say, "What are you thinking?" But I think that their response will be, you're free to, as a democratically elected government, you're free to put up whatever rules you like. But those are the kinds of rules that don't make commercial sense to us. And so if that's the rules that you want to have, then Canada just isn't a market that we want to be part of. And so what we will find, I think, were C-10 to pass in its current form and the CRTC to follow through with some of these kinds of powers, would be that there would be many services that would simply say, well, we're just going to exit the market altogether. It just, the Canadian market stops making sense when you start saying to some of those services, well, you're now subject to a Canadian regulator, even if you happen to have a small number of Canadian subscribers. And if the CRTC establishes thresholds whereby you get a bunch of these services that say, well, okay, you're outside the threshold, I think it still renders the Canadian market a tough one for many of these foreign providers, because effectively what the CRTC would be saying through the, by extension, amplifying the government's rules, is that if you grow big enough, suddenly now you're subject to these rules. So there are very few businesses that say, well, I'm going to enter into a marketplace, but I want to make sure that I cap the number of subscribers that I have, because otherwise I'm going to be subject to all this new regulation. I mean, then what's the point? And so many of them will simply say, we're just better off staying out altogether, and Canadians will find, and this was a point that did come up during some of the Senate discussions, is that it will particularly affect multicultural communities that have family members in different countries around the world that like to stay connected, oftentimes through those different sorts of streaming services. And yet those services will say the Canadian market, it's a useful one, but it isn't worth all these regulatory headaches. And suddenly you find yourself cut off. We're cutting off the very kind of multicultural type content that the government professes to support.
Well, it's a disincentive for people to want to grow and make money. So if you've got some budding YouTube star in Canada that is going to lose his or her international exposure, then that is really cutting off your nose to spite your face.
Well, that's, so you're bringing in the digital side, which I think is right. You're right to do. So, from the commercial streaming service perspective, I think what you find is some of these services just cut off the Canadian market. From an individual performer perspective, if those kinds of performers find that they are being harmed by these rules, well, they're going to go elsewhere. And, this irony of talking about, we want to ensure that there's a successful market in Canada for Canadian creators to stay here. Well, you may be driving some of those very creators out of the country if they're ultimately harmed by these rules.
In the flip side of this too, and we heard these concerns raised that a lot of, the streaming services, the big tech companies, they got lots of money. They were lobbying the chair of the CRTC, and I'm sure they were talking to members of parliament or friends thereof, and they wanted, a lot of the protections that people were looking for, as we mentioned earlier, Section 4.1 to, protect user-generated content. They thought that might just get in the way. They wanted, we've got this whole process going on, and there's one group over here that has a whole bunch of change a lot of money in which to achieve its goals. And then kind of the public that's sitting out there becoming passive consumers of they don't know what, because they have got no say over it.
Yeah, no, and those are always going to be some of the concerns. I would note that, certainly on the telecom side, there's been some, I think, very important stories about the role that lobbying has been playing by some of the large players, the Bells of the world, directly with the CRTC chair, that I think a lot of people are taking notice of and have some real concerns about. I would say, though, that in terms of sort of big tech being subject to this particular piece of legislation, my general sense is they actually did not play a significant role, beyond Netflix, which did appear before the committee. Most of the other companies didn't. And, for good reason, because the user-generated content exemptions ensured that that particular issue just was outside the scope of the law. And, so they in fact were never heard from as part of committee, which, while I recognize there are many people that are quite happy to take the opposite side from these companies. If you're going to regulate these entities, especially with the kind of regulation that no other country in the world has seen fit to impose, surely you ought to hear from them at a minimum to understand whether or not this is even doable, or if it is, how would it be implemented, and what would be the implications or ramifications of that kind of legislation. But the House study of this was so deeply flawed that they didn't hear from digital first creators, didn't hear from consumer groups to work through the consumer implications of this, and they didn't hear from some of the very companies that would find themselves subject to this kind of regulation.
And former CRTC chairs and members saying, we don't want to get into this business. We don't want to be looking at your tweets and you're listening to every podcast in Canada. We can't do it. We'd have to have a staff of thousands.
Yeah, no, there was a lot of criticism coming from some of those people. I had the former chair of the CRTC, Conrad von Finkenstein, on my own podcast. And Conrad was very critical both of some of the decisions we've seen from the CRTC on the wireless related issues in terms of pricing for wireless services and internet services. But beyond that, was deeply concerned with C-10 and raised real questions about whether or not the CRTC was the right venue and whether it had the capabilities to deal with these kinds of issues.
And then we've got this companion bill, 36, that they announced 27 minutes before the House rose, which touches on a lot of the same issues of free speech and censorship. So that's going to be a whole other can of worms.
It's another issue. I mean, I think, the hate speech issues are serious ones. And, when we're dealing certainly with criminal, with speech that is criminal, and you'd want to see, I believe, that the law be appropriately enforced. This seeks to address both the criminal side as well as the Human Rights Commission side. Does so without providing support for the Human Rights Commission to do its job, and there's concerns about how that system could be gamed. And of course, beyond that, there's the role of the platforms and some of the social media issues, and that's where the industry minister Guilbeault Heritage Minister Guilbeault had really talked about aggressively moving in this direction. But I think that there had been no public consultation on this issue, and the experience with C-10 perhaps had the government thinking twice as to whether or not they wanted to introduce that bill as well. But the sort of the net result out of all of this, I would agree, certainly both in C-10 and C-36, as well as in, I guess, future legislation that will come post-election if we get one, is that we are engaged in, I guess, national policy making when it comes to content on the internet, when it comes to appropriate behavior on the internet. Some will say there should be no rules. Some think that that's my view, but it's not. I mean, I do think that offline rules ought to be applied online as well. But I also think that what we need is a mature discussion based on facts. And I feel like what we got with C-10 was a lot of name calling from the minister. It was all this web giants and demonization of the sector, and the sense I often felt that he thought that there was really no limit to how far you could go in terms of trying to blame them for certain ills and seek to hold them accountable. And I think if there's a takeaway from what we saw in C-10, it's that I think the public do want to see appropriate rules, but at the same time, and those I think would include things like competition law and privacy. But beyond that, they also want to ensure that free speech is properly protected. They want to ensure that there's appropriate due process. They want to ensure that there's some balance there. And I don't believe that we got that with this bill at all.
No, we didn't get it, but I don't know, and I'm sure you've gotten the same because you're out there in the Twitterverse all the time reporting on all of this. I certainly have been doing the same. I'm astounded. I mean, nothing else that I've ever said in my life has touched a nerve like this about people's core belief that free speech and is part of who we are. It's a Canadian value. It's a larger value than that, but they feel very protective of it. I'm kind of glad to see that because we don't often have that debate in Canada. Free speech seems more the bailiwick of Americans. It's in their constitution. They talk about it. But silently, people have really, really embraced this.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. There certainly were so many that spoke out, and I definitely heard from many, and I was really happy to see it. That's for sure. It is heartening to see the Canadians, if they feel something that their freedom of expression is under threat, are willing to speak out, and that's, I think, precisely what we saw here. I would say the flip in some ways, my disappointment was from some of the creator groups who, I understand a desire to see this legislation go through, but the willingness to both support legislation that I thought raised significant concerns, and then even more support a process that, in my view, really raised fundamental democratic concerns, especially a committee where you had MPs voting on amendments
Secret
that were not
amendments.
made public, and
Yeah.
then of course you had the super motion to cut short debate, and to see those same groups who, on the one hand, argue that they are the very first to stand up and support freedom of expression, but then come with a big but, and there was a big but here, and it was about, well, we need this law, and so there was a but in terms of the implications of the law, substantively of the law, and then of course in terms of the process, and to me that was discouraging because. I actually don't think freedom of expression is just a primarily U.S. thing. I do believe that Canadians really stand up very strongly for this, and I guess I expected better. I expected better
to fight for that, like
yeah.
grandfathers and fathers, and you don't give that up easily. No, that's a really good point. That when the cash was dangled, somehow the issue became less discoverable, should we put it that way, in their commentary about this bill. Well, Michael, thank you very much for this summary. I think we're all. It's been held at bay, this piece of legislation. Government really does have time now. If there is an election, if there isn't, they have time to rethink this and maybe go back to the drawing board. And I hope they do. It sounds like you do too.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this isn't about no legislation, but it's about getting the right kind of legislation. And this really does, I think, provide a bit of a cooling off period, and one would hope an opportunity to reflect a little bit on the mistakes in this bill, to take a bit more seriously the criticisms, not to see them as just some radical fringe, as there were attempts to try to characterize it, but rather to a representative of a broadly held view, and to try to come back with legislation that that better reflects that kind of widely held views, as well as ensuring that the process that we get incorporates all of those perspectives along the way.
Thanks for being such a dogged observer and a watchdog, and for just keeping at this. I think you've really educated a lot of people on this, and there you are, a professor. I guess it's your job, isn't it?
I've always, I think so. I've always been a believer in trying to take the research and the work, and of course, ensure that students are a big part of it, but ensure that the public is too. I think that's part of the mandate. And so it's been an interesting couple of months, that's for sure.
Well, Professor Dr. Michael Geist, professor at the University of Ottawa, holds the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law. So this is your bailiwick. So we'll be back talking in the fall, I bet. I'll invite you right now, because we're going to have to do it when this legislation comes back. Thanks again so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Bye-bye now. And that is it for No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen, at least for now.